What if an entire end times doctrine, one that shapes how some picture the last days, rests on at least 7 claims the Bible never actually states? Stay with me, because by the end of this, you'll be able to test that for yourself. The classic pre-wrath position differentiates between the period of the Great Tribulation, which it defines as the period of the Antichrist's wrath against the church and Israel, from the wrath of God, which follows the Great Tribulation and is meant for unbelievers. The position also claims that the Great Tribulation is cut short at some unknown point between the abomination of desolation and the end of Daniel's 70th week, at which point the rapture also occurs. Although the distinction between the Great Tribulation, spearheaded by the Antichrist, and the wrath of God, instigated by God himself, is clearly shown throughout Scripture, the claim that the Great Tribulation is cut short before the end of Daniel's 70th week, at which point the rapture happens, requires 7 separate things to be true, which most people are probably unaware of. But are these 7 things, which are tenets or foundation of the classic pre-wrath, biblically accurate? Let's test them with the Scriptures. In this video, we'll put the first 2 to the test. The remaining 5 we'll take on in the videos ahead. First, the classic pre-wrath doctrine requires 2 great tribulations, not 1. One great tribulation for Israel, which has a fixed duration of 3.5 years, and a separate one for the church that can be and will be cut short to less than that. Both starting at the same moment, both triggered by the same event, but somehow not the same tribulation. According to the pre-wrath's own teaching, when Jesus made reference to the Great Tribulation being shortened in Matthew 24, he was referring to the Great Tribulation of believers, not the Great Tribulation mentioned in Daniel and in the book of Revelation. Because if Jesus had referred to the Great Tribulation mentioned in Revelation, which is fixed at 3.5 years, then Jesus would have been contradicting himself. A second tenet of the pre-wrath rapture doctrine is the claim that Scripture does not allow us to say exactly how long the Great Tribulation for the church will last. Thirdly, the pre-wrath rapture teaching requires and claims that Jesus' second coming is the event that cuts the Great Tribulation short and brings it to an end for the church, not an event that happens after the tribulation has already ended. Fourth, the pre-wrath position claims that cut short in Matthew 24:22, which is used in reference to the Great Tribulation, is meaningless and incoherent unless it signals for the church a reduction below the 3.5 years Great Tribulation Daniel talked about in his 70 weeks prophecy. Fifth, in Matthew 24:22, Jesus said, "But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short." These words of Jesus are also quoted in Mark 13:20, where we read, "But for the sake of the elect whom he chose, he shortened the days," in Mark 13:20. However, the pre-wrath position rather quotes Jesus as explicitly saying, "The days of tribulation will be cut short for the elect." So, did Jesus say the elect were the reason for the Great Tribulation being cut short, or the elect were the exclusive beneficiaries of the Great Tribulation being cut short? Both statements are not the same. Sixth, when Jesus said in Matthew 24:22 that unless those days had been cut short, no life would have been saved, the pre-wrath position requires that statement to be read as unless the Great Tribulation of believers had been cut short, no believer would have been saved. Thus, no life or no flesh in that biblical text should exclusively refer to believers or Christians according to the pre-wrath rapture teaching. And lastly, the position claims to have solved a problem by making the day of Jesus' return unknowable after the Great Tribulation. However, does this problem even exist in Scripture when the Great Tribulation lasts the full 3.5 years noted in Revelation and Daniel? That's the foundation. Now let's go to the text and see whether it can hold the weight being placed on it. It is worthy of note that in Matthew 24:22, Jesus did not say that unless the experience of the Great Tribulation by his disciples had been cut short. It was not anyone's experience of the tribulation that had to be shortened, while the tribulation he was talking about continued. Rather, the cutting short was with respect to the very days or duration of the tribulation period itself. So, what days of tribulation was Jesus referring to? Before saying anything about the Great Tribulation being cut short or his return after the Great Tribulation, Jesus first told us exactly which tribulation he meant. In Matthew 24:15-21, he said, "When you see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel, standing in the holy place, flee, for then there will be a great tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. Unless those days had been cut short, no life would have been saved, but for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short." In Jesus' own words, the Great Tribulation he described to his disciples is the Great Tribulation that begins with the abomination of desolation Daniel spoke of, which will be the worst tribulation the world has ever seen until then. In fact, Jesus' description of this tribulation as the worst the world has ever seen is the exact same description Daniel gave to the Great Tribulation he talked about, which is also triggered by the same abomination of desolation. Daniel 11:31-12 verses 2 says that they will set up the abomination of desolation. Now at that time, there will be a time of distress or tribulation such as never occurred since there was a nation until that time. Now pay attention to this. Both Jesus and Daniel's description of the Great Tribulation they talked about as the singular, unmatched, and worst that has ever been rules out any duplication and forbids a two-tribulation framework. Two separate events can't both be the singular, unmatched, and worst tribulation in history at the same time. If Jesus referred to a separate tribulation than Daniel did, then both Jesus and Daniel would have lied by both claiming that their separate great tribulations, both triggered by the same abomination of desolation, is the single worst tribulation that has ever been. However, since God cannot lie and Scripture cannot be broken, this cannot be the case. So Jesus did not leave the Great Tribulation undefined, and he did not introduce a new one. He identified the tribulation he described with Daniel's own tribulation using the same unique identifier that separates it from every other tribulation in history and tying it to the same triggering event, the abomination of desolation. This one unparalleled, unmatched tribulation, described by both Jesus and Daniel, is explicitly measured in Daniel as lasting exactly 3.5 years, from the moment the abomination is committed at the midpoint of the 7-year period to the end of that period, Daniel 9:27. Daniel repeats this multiple times, stating that the Antichrist will have authority for a time, 1 year, times, 2 years, and half a time, half a year, 3.5 years total, Daniel 7:25, and that the Great Tribulation itself lasts the same duration, Daniel 12:7. The book of Revelation confirms the same thing. Revelation 13:5-7 says that the Antichrist is given authority for 42 months over every tribe, people, and tongue. And Revelation 12:14 and Revelation 11:1-2 also add that the Great Tribulation likewise lasts a time, times, and half a time, or 42 months, 3.5 years, matching Daniel exactly. According to the Scriptures, the duration of the Antichrist's authority equals the length of the tribulation itself, 3.5 years. Moreover, Revelation makes clear that this Great Tribulation, the same one Daniel describes, does not affect only the church or only Israel, but every tribe, people, and tongue on earth, Jew or Gentile, saved or unsaved. Revelation 13:5-15. So Jesus did not leave the tribulation he was talking about undefined. He identified it as the very one Daniel described, a tribulation affecting Israel, the church, and every tribe on earth, lasting exactly 3.5 years, no more and no less. And he identified it with the same unique identifier Daniel used that set it apart in all of history as the worst tribulation ever at the time it begins. So, when you read Matthew 24:15-31 without adding to the text or taking anything from it, it is evidently clear that Jesus first described the tribulation as the uniquely singular, unmatched, worst tribulation of all time, beginning with the abomination of desolation, exactly as Daniel described the one he spoke of. Then, from that point on, in Matthew 24:22-31, Jesus referred back to this same tribulation using the phrases "those days" and "the tribulation of those days," obviously expecting his disciples to know exactly which tribulation he meant, since he had already defined it. So when Jesus continued saying, "Unless those days had been cut short, no life would have been saved," which days was he referring to? He had already explicitly identified those days as the tribulation Daniel spoke of, the one beginning with the abomination of desolation, uniquely the worst tribulation history will ever see. The claim that Jesus suddenly shifted to describing a separate tribulation for the church, rather than the specific tribulation he had just referenced in Daniel, cannot survive the text of Matthew 24:15-22. The same applies when Jesus says that immediately after the tribulation of those days, there will be signs in the sun, moon, and stars. The powers of heaven will be shaken, the sign of the Son of Man will appear, and all the earth will see him come. Which tribulation of those days is in view? Again, Jesus explicitly ties it to the same tribulation Daniel described, the one beginning with the abomination of desolation, uniquely the worst in history when it begins. So, the claim that there is no evidence in the immediate context that Jesus identified the duration of the Great Tribulation with the 3.5 years of the second half of Daniel's 71st week cannot survive Matthew 24:15-21. The context does not merely permit the identification. Jesus made this identification himself right there in the text, quoting Daniel by name and echoing Daniel's own words. Jesus' clear, unambiguous identification of the tribulation he described with Daniel's tribulation, uniquely marking it as the worst period in history, disproves the prewrath claim that Scripture never states Christians will endure the full 42-month Great Tribulation and that no one can know when it will end. What then of the claim that if the tribulation lasts the full 42 months, believers could predict the exact day of Jesus' coming, something Scripture says no one can do? In truth, no such problem exists in Scripture if the church endures the entire 3.5-year tribulation. The hidden assumption behind this claim is that everything from the Antichrist's rise through the abomination of desolation, the Great Tribulation, the wrath of God, Jesus' appearing, and the end of the age to the beginning of the millennium must be forced into a single 7-year time frame. But the Bible never forces all these events into 7 years. This is an assumption laid over the text, one Scripture itself rejects. We'll examine this in detail in a future video. So as promised, let's put the first 2 of these 7 tenets to the test. It needed 2 tribulations, but Jesus' own words, echoing Daniel's own words, rule that out. There is one tribulation described identically by both because there cannot be 2 events in history, each holding the title of the worst there has ever been. It needed Scripture to be silent on how long the church's tribulation lasts. But Scripture isn't silent. Daniel states the length multiple times. Revelation confirms it. 42 months. For Israel, for the church, and for the whole earth, because it's the same tribulation for all mankind. Read in context, without adding to the text or taking from it, Matthew 24 shows one clear pattern, one tribulation, defined once by Jesus, identified with Daniel's tribulation, referred back to consistently, never split into 2. So here's the question worth sitting with. If an entire end times framework, one that shapes how we should read prophecy, how we should picture the last days, even how we should read our own Bibles, turns out to rest on an assumption the text itself never makes, what do you do with that? Are you willing to test what you've been taught against what the Bible actually says, just as the Bible teaches us to do? That's the real question underneath all of this. Not which position wins the argument, but are we building on what Scripture says, or on what we've assumed it must mean? Because building on what Scripture says is our only guaranteed way of overcoming and living triumphantly in these last days. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe. And for more biblical resources on the end time, see the video description and the bio. God bless you.